Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Crash Course. Today we're talking about convict leasing and mass incarceration, and that's going to be with Josh, Andrew, and myself.
Thanks, Singer, for the amazing introduction. Now, to understand how convict leasing started in the first place, we're going to have to take a deep dive into how the northern and southern economies divided in the first place. Here we go. Differences in climate, economic practices, religious practices, political and cultural differences caused the North and the South to develop in two different ways. One, dependent on slavery, and the other one, independent from slavery. The northern soil and climate favored smaller farms and did not require large quantities of slaves to keep operational. They discovered new natural resources and developed new technology. Natural resources such as iron, copper, silver, coal, and water were taken advantage of and used to create infrastructure, make goods, generate profit, and more. The establishment of the railroad in the north promoted growth of these industries and allowed for mass production and the transportation of goods and people. Inventions such as the steamboat engine, the light bulb, the assembly line, and motors further advanced industrial progression.
On the other hand, the fertile soil and warm climate of the South allowed for large-scale cash crops such as cotton and tobacco to be in enormous abundance. However, with such high demand on labor-intensive crops, Southerners relied on slave labor to make a majority of their profit. In 1793, the invention of the cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode because it reduced the amount of labor and time spent on removing seeds. Thus, more labor and land could be used to meet their increased output potential, also greatly increasing the areas where cotton could be profitably grown. Because plantations were so profitable, many Southerners didn't see a need to industrialize. After the Civil War, Reconstruction marked the beginning of the end of old America and brought along with it new ideals and goals for the future of the United States. Now, were all these ideals good? No, they weren't anywhere close to where we are today. And do you think the people of the South just flipped a switch and immediately turned on and became their old ideals? Of course they didn't do that. Instead, the South had to come up with every loophole strategy to get around the new rules of the now polished country. And one of those loopholes involved the currently weak-minded criminal justice system.
Anyways, convict leasing, like sharecropping, was just another way for plantation owners to run plantations without slavery. After the Civil War, the South's economy, society, and government were in shambles. Southern state governments struggled to raise money to repair damaged infrastructure and to support new expenses, such as universal public education. The prison problem was especially challenging, as most prisons had been destroyed during the war. Initially, some states paid private contractors to house and feed prisoners. However, within a few years, states realized that they could lease out their convicts to local plantations for profit. After the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the 13th Amendment had been ratified, the South couldn't just get rid of their plantations that they so relied on. So they found a loophole instead. Convicts who had been incarcerated for a crime could be forced to work for free. Prisons realized the profitability of convict leasing. Prisons started incarcerating African Americans for minor charges and even trumped-up charges. Many consider the aftermath of slavery worse than slavery itself. When plantation owners owned slaves, it would be economically counterproductive to work your slave to death, as you would be losing your investment. However, in the case of convict leasing, it would be more economically profitable to work your slave to death. Plantation owners would get cheap labor, and after a period of time, you would need to pay for the labor again. So plantation owners would do whatever they could to maximize their investments. These plantation owners had no regard for the lives of their workers. As to them, there was more from where that came from. In the 1850s, 99% of Alabama's incarcerated population was white. By the 1880s, however, 85% of the population was black. The fact of the matter is, it is quite frankly impossible that such a large proportion of the black population was getting justifiably arrested for their crimes in such a small period of time. It is without a doubt that the criminal justice system targeted both innocent and guilty alike. Although convict leasing was abolished December 12, 1941, its effects still last to this day.
What is this? What is this? Oh, it's my favorite time of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for Guess That Quote. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night in the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Any guesses? I'll leave you a moment. Yeah, someone actually said this. Any guys? No? Okay. Well, this quote was said by John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor. Said this in a 1994 interview about the war on drugs. And you will hear about that more with Andrew.
Great. That's enough from that dude. Now let's talk about how that old stuff brought us to where we are today. Even in modern society, over half a century removed from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, African Americans still experience the lasting effects of the institutional racism that has been embedded in our country, especially in regards to the prison industry. Which brings us to the topic of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is defined as a network of policing, prosecution, incarceration, surveillance, debt, and social control that is rooted in, builds upon, and reproduces economic and racial inequality and oppression. For the math and statistics people out there, it can be put into perspective through numbers. Over 2 million people are confined in jail and prison nationwide, a 500% increase over the last 4 decades. Furthermore, mass incarceration disproportionately affects African Americans, with African Americans making up 40% of the incarcerated population, but only 13% of the total population in the US. Legislation and government initiatives have been the biggest contributors to mass incarceration, beginning with the War on Drugs in 1971. The War on Drugs was a government initiative during Richard Nixon's presidency, which introduced many policies in order to minimize drug abuse, such as increasing the minimum sentence for drug offenses. Now this in theory doesn't sound too bad, but it was yet another excuse for the over-policing and incarceration of African Americans. From 1980 to 2011, the number of African Americans arrested for violent crimes dropped, but the number of African Americans arrested for drug crimes rose dramatically. Reports have shown that black people are far more likely to be arrested for possessing or selling drugs, even though white people statistically use drugs at the same rate and are more likely to sell drugs. Just like John Ehrlichman from Will's quote claimed, it was never about the drugs, which we know is true not only because he said it, but also because most of the laws they put into place didn't even work. For example, research has shown that increasing sentences for drug crimes does not reduce drug use. The war on drugs has not been the only contributor to mass incarceration, though. Another huge player has been stop and frisk laws, which have been implemented in some form by all 50 states, most notably in New York. Stop and frisk allows police officers to stop and pat down anybody that they suspect has been, is about to be, or is committing a crime. Not only is this very controversial on the topic of the Fourth Amendment, but it is yet another form of legislation that targets African American people. African Americans are far more likely to be stopped and frisked, even if they weren't doing anything wrong in the moment. Although there is so much more regarding these topics, the last thing that I will mention is police and private prison quotas. Just like in the days of convict leasing, modern-day private prisons are businesses. In short, policemen are required to arrest a certain number of people, or else they will need to pay millions of dollars to the private prison owners. African Americans are again targeted by this need to fill up these prisons. Overall, it is important to understand that our criminal justice system still needs reform, and systemic racism is a prevalent and very dangerous part of our society today, just as it was during the period of convict leasing.